Greetings, travelers of the void. You have entered the domain of the void-born terrors. Every ocean has a bottom, and every bottom has a thing living on it that the sunlit water has never seen. The galaxy is no different. Out past the last charted lane, past the final flickering thread of the Astronomican, the great psychic beacon that burns from holy terror and lets mankind's ships find their way home. There is a place with no light and no name. The Imperium calls it, when it must call it anything, the outer dark. Most of mankind lives and dies without learning it exists. Things live out there. Some of them were born there, and some of them, a very long time ago, were ours. This is the story of a mining world at the edge of everything, and of the two kinds of predator that found it in the same season. The first came howling, and broadcast its howling on every channel, because it wanted the whole world to hear what was coming for them. The second came in silence. No hail, no warning, no word at all. And the people of that world, hiding in their black shafts with their hands over their mouths, made the mistake every prey animal makes in the dark. They heard the howling stop, and they thought that meant they were saved. Listen close, traveler, and ask yourself which you would rather hear coming, the scream or the nothing. Chapter 1. The Cold. There is no sun over Kalyx Deep. There is a sun somewhere, a dim red coal, 400 million kilometers out, that the charts insisted was the system primary, and that nobody on Kalyx had ever seen do anything useful. It gave no warmth, and it barely gave light. And the world it failed to warm was a ball of black rock and frozen gases and ice that had never once, in the 400 years of the Imperium's charter there, thawed. Marda Wren had been born on it. So had her mother and her mother's mother, and so had every one of the 11,000 souls who worked the deep, and none of them had ever stood under an open sky that wasn't black. That was simply what a sky was. You went out on the surface in a rig suit, and you looked up and there was nothing. Not the crowded star fields you saw in the pictures and the devotional plates, not the Emperor's own glorious firmament, but a low, empty, grudging scatter of far-off pinpricks. And between them, more nothing than a human mind is built to look at. They were at the rim. That was the phrase, the one every child on Kalyx learned before they learned to work a cutter. We're at the rim, love. Past us there's nothing but the outer dark, and nothing lives out there. That was the first lie Kalyx Deep taught its children, and it was not told out of cruelty. Nobody knew it was a lie, not yet. Marda was a shift boss on the number 4 seam, 41 years old, with a bad shoulder from a rock fall at 19, and the deep, permanent cold in her joints that every Kalyx miner carried by 40. She ran a crew of 26. She was good at it, not because she was clever, she'd have told you, but because she counted. She counted her people onto the lift at the start of a shift, and she counted them off at the end, every shift, for 11 years. And in 11 years she had never once come up short. That was the whole of her ambition. 26 down, 26 up. It doesn't sound like much to build a life on. Out there, at the rim, where the ice never broke and the dark never lifted and the tithe ships came once a decade if they came at all, it was more than most people had. You should understand what it means properly to live outside the light of the Astronomican, because the Imperium's whole shape depends on that light, and almost nobody who lives inside it ever thinks about the edge. The Astronomican is a beacon, not of fire, of mind. On Terra, in the heart of the Imperial Palace, something that was once a man sits on a golden chair and burns, and the burning throws a psychic light out across the galaxy, and that light is the only reason mankind's ships can cross the warp without being lost forever. Navigators steer by it the way sailors once steered by a star. Astropaths shout along it the way you shout down a corridor. Everything the Imperium is, every fleet, every crusade, every tithe, every order that ever reached a governor from a lord 1,000 light years away, rides on that one light. And it does not reach forever. It weakens with distance, the way any light does. Out past the great spiral arms, out where the stars thin and the charts run to guesswork, and the last relay stations sit in the dark like men holding lanterns at the end of a pier, the beacon becomes a rumor. Then a suggestion, then nothing. And what lies past that is called, in the few imperial documents that admit to it, the outer dark. Kalyx Deep sat on the last rung, not past the light. The charter would never have been granted past the light, but at the very bottom of it, where the beacon was so faint that Syl the astropath had spent her whole life straining after it, the way a half-deaf woman strains after a voice in another room. It was why the tithe ships came once a decade instead of once a year. A navigator making the run to Kalyx was working at the ragged edge of what a navigator can do, and no shipmaster made that crossing more often than the charter obliged him to. It was why, when Syl died, Kalyx Deep did not simply lose a woman, it lost its only voice. 11,000 people at the bottom of a shaft on a frozen rock, with no astropath, no ship, and no way to tell anyone anywhere that anything was wrong. And above them, in every direction, the black going on and on, to a distance that has no honest number. That is the condition the Imperium's fringe worlds live in and never speak about. Not danger, distance. The absolute practical certainty that if something comes for you, no help is coming. Because the nearest help is 9 years away and does not know you exist. Every soul on Kalyx Deep understood that, in their bones, without ever having to say it. And it made them a particular kind of people. Hard, close, fatalistic, unsentimental, deeply and quietly kind to each other, in the way of people who know that each other is all there is. Understand what Kalyx was, because it matters, and because the Imperium is full of places like it, and never thinks about them. It was a hole in the ground with people in it. The Adeptus Mechanicus had come 4 centuries back, sunk shafts into the black rock, found a seam of something the Imperium wanted, a heavy blue-grey ore they called sable iron, that went into void ship armor, and that you could not apparently get anywhere closer. And then the Mechanicus had gone away again and left a charter, a supply schedule, and 11,000 indentured lives to work it. Generations of them now. Nobody on Kalyx had chosen to be there. Nobody could leave. There was nowhere to leave to, and no ship to leave on. You were born in the Habs. You went into the shafts at 14. You worked until the cold or the dust or a fall took you, and they burned you in the reclamation furnaces because there was no soil to bury you in that wasn't frozen a kilometer deep. That was the whole span. That was Kalyx Deep. And the astonishing thing, the thing Marder thought about later, when there was nothing left to think about, is that people had made lives in it anyway. There were weddings. There were feast days when the mash still ran. There was a shrine where old Deacon Halvers said the litanies over a plaster aquila, and people went and meant it. 11,000 people at the edge of the universe making a life out of rock and ice and each other, and the Imperium's whole opinion of them was a shipping quota. The paperwork gives you the measure of it better than any description could. Kalyx Deep was registered as a grade 9 tithe holding, which is the lowest grade that still requires a charter at all. Its entry in the sector registry ran to 4 lines. Its population figure had not been revised in 112 years, because revising it would have required an astropathic message, and astropathic messages cost more than the administratum was prepared to spend on a rock that produced sable iron and nothing else. 11,000 subjects of the Emperor of Mankind, and the total attention the Imperium paid them was a quota and a stale number in a ledger 9 years away. That was not cruelty. Nobody hated Kalyx Deep. It is simply what happens at the far end of an empire of 1,000,000 worlds. The arithmetic gets very large, and the rounding errors have people in them. Tam was 15, and he was on her crew, and he was not supposed to be. That was the other thing about Marda Wren. She'd taken the boy on 2 years early because his parents had both gone in the 7-level collapse, and the alternative was the reclamation gangs, which was not a place a 12-year-old came back from as a person. She'd falsified his age on the shift roster. Overseer Vaughn knew and had taken a cut of her ration credit for 4 years to keep knowing it quietly. She'd have paid twice. The boy was clever and quick and had a way of finding a joke in the worst hour of the worst shift, and she loved him with the ferocious, unsentimental, entirely unspoken love that people at the bottom of the Imperium have for the 1 or 2 things they've managed to keep. "You're counting again," Tam said. They were on the number 4 lift, going down, 42 minutes of falling through black rock in a rattling cage, the way they had 5 days out of 6 for 2 years. "I'm always counting. You count out loud when you're worried." He was grinning, hanging off the cage bar, all elbows. 26. 26. "What's got you worried, boss?" She hadn't told them. None of the shift bosses had told their crews, because Overseer Vaughn had stood up in the muster hall 3 days back, with his hands shaking, and told them all not to. And for once in his officious ration-skimming life, Vaughn had probably been right. She looked at the boy hanging off the cage bar in the dark, all elbows and grin, and thought about the things she had heard in the muster hall, and about the fact that in about 6 weeks it would not matter what any of them had been told. She thought about how she had first met him, a 12-year-old standing at the mouth of number 7 with his parents somewhere under 400,000 tons of collapsed sable iron, not crying, just standing, with the particular blankness of a child who has understood something too big and is waiting for an adult to come and make it smaller. She hadn't made it smaller. There is no making it smaller. She had simply said, "You'll come on my crew," which was against regulation and against sense, and the boy had said, "Yes, ma'am," in that same blank voice, and it had taken 8 months before he made a joke, and she remembered the joke, and she remembered exactly where she had been standing when he made it. "You going to tell me?" Tam said. The grin had gone off him. He was quicker than she gave him credit for. He always had been. "Whatever it is, you'll tell me before the others, right?" "Why would I do that?" "Because I'm your favorite," he said, and got the grin back. "And because if you don't, I'll work it out anyway, and then I'll be insufferable about it." She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, and it hung in the cage light, and 42 minutes of black rock went past. "There's a thing at the edge of the system," she said at last. "Syl saw it before she died. That's all anybody knows. Don't repeat it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Is it coming here?" "Everything comes here eventually, love," Marda said. "That's the only thing about being at the bottom of a hole. Whatever's up there, it comes down." She had meant it as the sort of grim joke that passes for comfort 3 kilometers underground. She has thought about that sentence, on and off, for the rest of her life. The astropath had died. Kalyx Deep had one. Every Imperial holding has to have one, or a relay or something. A sanctioned psyker to carry the messages that no Vox can carry across the void. The Imperium's only nervous system. Kalyx's was an old woman named Syl, blind the way they're all blind, who lived in a heated cell near the comms mast, and who most people saw twice a year. She had been screaming for 11 days. Not words at first, then words. Then on the 12th day, she had opened the veins in both her arms with a ration spoon she had been sharpening, apparently for some time. The last thing she'd sent was not a message to anyone. The comm serfs had recorded it because recording was their job, and Vaughn had played it in the muster hall with his hands shaking, and Marder had stood at the back of that hall and listened to a dead woman's voice say, over and over, in the flat, exhausted tone of someone repeating a thing she'd already said 100 times to people who wouldn't listen. There's a shadow at the edge of the system. It's been there for 11 days. It's not moving under power. It's drifting, and it's drifting in, and there's something awake inside it, and it has noticed that we're here. Do not signal it. Do not answer it. For the Emperor's love, put out the lights. There was more on the recording, and Vaughn had cut it off, and the comm serfs talked, because comm serfs always talk. What Syl had been screaming, in the 11 days before the words came, was not fear. It was effort. She had been trying to make herself heard. An astropath at the bottom of the beacon's reach, alone, with a thing coming, spending 11 days throwing her mind up at a light so faint she could barely find it, calling for anyone. The relay at Thessos, the sector command, any passing ship, any astropath anywhere in the black who might be listening, and getting nothing back. 11 days of shouting into a corridor with nobody in it. That is what killed her, the comm serf said, more than anything else. Not what she saw, but the 11 days of learning, over and over, hour after hour, that there was no one out there to hear it. She opened her arms on the 12th day, because on the 12th day she finally believed it. And there was a fragment at the end, right at the end, that the comm serfs would repeat to each other in the corridors in the weeks after, in a lowered voice, the way you repeat a thing you wish you hadn't heard. Syl had gone quiet for a while, and then said quite calmly, in the exhausted flat voice of a woman who has stopped arguing, "There's something else out there, further out, past the shadow. It isn't coming here, it doesn't know about us, but it's out there in the deep dark, and it's been out there a very long time, and I don't think it's the same kind of thing at all. I keep brushing against it when I reach. It's like..." A long pause on the recording. 30 seconds of tape hiss. It's like putting your hand in water in the dark and touching something that doesn't move. Something that lets you touch it. Something patient. And then, after another pause, the last words she ever spoke. "I hope it stays out there. Emperor, keep us. I hope it stays out there." The lights. That was the part that had made Marder's neck prickle, standing at the back of that hall. Because Kalyx Deep was a beacon. It had to be. The surface installations, the smelter stacks, the landing field, the comms mast, all of it lit up against the black, so the decadal TITHE ship could find them, running the same emergency lumen array that had been running since the Mechanicus laid it down 400 years ago. 11,000 people at the bottom of a hole in the dark, with a light on the top of it, blinking steadily out into the outer dark, where nothing lived. "Nothing's got me worried," Marder said to Tam, and counted her crew off the lift. 26. The shadow at the edge of the system was not a shadow. 4 days after Syl opened her arms, the surface watch got optical on it, and Kalyx Deep learned what had been drifting toward it for a fortnight, and the word went round the Habs faster than Vaughn could stop it. It was a ship, or it had been. It was several ships, and parts of ships, and other things that had never been ships, all fused together, kilometers of it. A rolling mountain of dead metal turning slowly end over end as it drifted. Wreckage from 100 wrecks welded into one enormous drifting tomb by 10,000 years of warp tide and gravity and time. Marder saw the picture plates. Everyone did. Vaughn couldn't keep them off the hab screens. She remembers a spar of some ancient hull, kilometers long, with the double-headed eagle of the Imperium still visible on it under the rime, and the eagle was upside down because the whole vast dead thing was rolling, slowly, the way a corpse rolls in water. Old Becker, who had worked the seams for 50 years and had a phrase for everything, looked at the plates and said the word nobody else on Kalyx knew. Hulk, he said. Space Hulk. Saw one once from the TITHE ship when I was a boy, and they took us up to load. They drift. They come out of the warp, and they go back into it, and they carry whatever's living in them along for the ride. He was quiet a moment, and then he said the thing that Marder has never been able to forget, because it was the last piece of ordinary wisdom she ever received from an ordinary man. The rule about Hulk's girl is you don't go to them, and you pray they don't come to you, because there's always something living in them. Always. And it's never anything you'd want as a neighbor. There was a fortnight between the Hulk becoming visible and the raiders coming off it, in which Kalyx Deep tried to prepare, and the shape of that fortnight is worth setting down, because it is the shape of every Fringe World's last month, and nobody ever writes it down. They welded the shaft heads. Vaughn had the machine shops turn out 300 spears, actual spears, lengths of drill stock with cutting heads brazed on, because there were 11 las carbines for 11,000 people, and something had to be put in their hands. The Medigi stocked out a 4th-level gallery as a casualty station, which was sensible, and which meant that when it came, the wounded would be gathered conveniently in one place. Somebody organized a lottery for the 4 surface survival capsules, which held 6 each, which had no drives, and which could sustain life for 11 days in a system 9 years from the nearest help, and 400 people entered that lottery, and the winners were drawn and announced on the Habvox, and people congratulated them in the corridors. Marder has never decided whether that was the most human thing she ever saw, or the saddest. The colony's reaction to the Hulk is worth setting down, because it is the reaction of every isolated human community that has ever seen the thing coming, and because it is not the reaction the picked reels would have you expect. There was no panic. There were 11,000 people on a rock with no ships, no weapons worth the name, nowhere to run, and nothing to run in. And what happened was that Kalyx Deep, having no available response, simply went on working. The shifts ran. The cage went down at the bell and came up at the bell. The mash still ran and the shrine filled on feast day, and people had their arguments about ration credit and rota positions exactly as they had the month before. And the whole time the thing rolled slowly closer in the black sky, and everybody knew, and nobody said. Marder thought about that a great deal afterward. The astonishing capacity of ordinary people to keep doing the ordinary thing in front of an approaching horror. Not because they are brave, and not because they are stupid, but because the alternative, stopping, screaming, admitting it, accomplishes precisely nothing and costs you the last few weeks of being a person. The only thing that changed was that people started coming to the shrine who hadn't come in years, and Deacon Halvers, who was old and had been dull for 30 years, started giving different sermons. Marder went twice. She was not a devout woman, she was a counting woman. But she went, and both times the old man said the same strange thing at the end, not as part of the litany, just said it, standing there with his hands on the plaster aquila. The Emperor protects. I have said that every week for 30 years, and I say it now, and I mean it. But I want you to hear the whole of the thing, and the whole of the thing is this. The Emperor protects, and the Emperor is very far away, and out here at the edge of his light, there is a great deal of dark between his hand and us. Pray. But do not confuse praying with being safe. Nothing out here is safe. Nothing out here has ever been safe. We simply have not, until now, been found. It's dead, said Vaughan, who had come down to the muster hall to be reassuring and had not managed it. It's a derelict. There's no power signature, no drive plume, nothing on the Vox. It's a dead ship, and it's going to pass us at 4 million kilometers and be gone in a week, and I will thank you all to get back to your shifts. He was right about the 4 million kilometers. He was right that there was no power signature, no drive plume, nothing on the Vox. He was wrong about the rest, and the way they found out he was wrong was this. On the 18th day, at the end of Marda's shift, 42 minutes up in the rattling cage, she came out onto the surface transfer deck, and the lights were off. Not failed. Off. Someone had killed the surface lumen array. The whole thing, the smelter stacks, the landing field, the mast, 400 years of beacon. And Kalyx Deep was dark for the first time in its history, and the 11,000 people on it were standing about in the black, asking each other what had happened, and up on the comms mast catwalk, alone, in the dark, in a rig suit, with a cutting torch in his hands, and the severed power trunk sparking at his feet, was old Deacon Halvers, who had said the litanies over the plaster aquila for 30 years. They got him down. He wasn't raving. That was the worst of it. Marda got close enough to see his face through the visor, and the old man was perfectly calm. And he looked at Vaughan, who was screaming at him about sabotage and the Emperor's Charter, and what the Mechanicus would do. And Deacon Halvers said mildly, the way he'd say a benediction, "Syl told us to put out the lights. She spent her last strength telling us. And you kept them burning for 18 days. He looked past Vaughan then, out at the black sky where a rolling mountain of dead metal was falling slowly toward them, and he said, "It doesn't matter now. They've had 18 days of us blinking at them. They know exactly where we are, and how many of us there are, and that we've nothing to shoot back with." "They," said Vaughan. And the old deacon smiled, which was a terrible thing to see on a man that calm. And he said, "Listen." And they listened. All of them, out on the dark transfer deck under the empty sky at the edge of the universe. 11,000 people who had never in 400 years had reason to be afraid of the void. And the Vox horns on the mast, the emergency array, the ones that hadn't carried anything but shift bells and litanies in living memory, crackled and began, very softly, to scream. Chapter 2. The Howling. They screamed for 6 days before they came. That is the thing about the Night Lords that no record ever quite captures, and the thing that Marda Wren would spend the rest of her short, strange life trying to explain to people who had not been on Kalyx Deep. They did not attack, not for 6 days. They arrived in the system, and they took the orbital high ground with 3 raider craft that came off the hulk like ticks off a dead dog. And then they did nothing at all except talk to Kalyx Deep on every channel it had, continuously for 144 hours. It started as screaming, recorded, looped, layered. The screams of people, and some of them were not people, and all of them went on far longer than a human throat should manage. It came out of the mast horns and the hab vox and the shaft comms and the little personal beads the shift bosses wore, all of it at once, and there was no switching it off, because they had gotten into the system somehow, into the machine spirits of the whole colony, and the comm serfs pulled the physical trunk lines, and it kept coming anyway. Then, on the second day, it started to talk. It had a voice like a man being pleasant. That's the only way Marda could ever describe it. Cultured, unhurried, warm, with an accent nobody on Kalyx had ever heard. Long vowels, soft consonants, a voice that sounded like it was smiling and never once stopped sounding like it was smiling for 6 days. "Good evening, Kalyx Deep," it said. "I do hope I'm not interrupting. I've been watching your lights for the better part of 3 weeks, and I want you to know how grateful I am. You've no idea how difficult it is to find anybody out here. You blink away so patiently for 400 years, and nobody comes, and then somebody does. It knew things. That was the second horror. It knew the colony's designation, and its charter date, and its ore quota. It knew the names of the shift bosses. It read them out, all 60 of them, slowly, in a warm, interested voice. And when it read Marder's name, she felt something in her stomach turn over and never quite turn back. It had been listening to 18 days of unsecured colony Vox traffic, that was all. That was the mundane explanation, and she clung to it. But at the time, in the dark, with the screaming underneath, it sounded like something that had always known her name. "Now, I want to be honest with you," the voice said on the 3rd day, "because I think honesty is a kindness, and there's so little kindness out here. I'm going to come down there. Not immediately. I'm in no hurry at all, and I'd like you to have some time. And when I come down, I'm going to take some of you for the pens, and I am going to use the rest of you for the other thing. And the other thing is going to take a long while, and I'd like you to be thinking about it. That's important to me, that you're thinking about it. Some of my brothers will tell you the fear is a tool. It isn't. The fear is the point. The rest is just how we harvest it. It is worth understanding what the 8th Legion actually is, because it explains the 6 days, and because without understanding it you will not feel the size of the change when it comes. They were made 10,000 years ago to be the Emperor's terror, not his shock troops. His terror, a specific and deliberate instrument. Their Primarch was raised on a world called Nostramo, a lightless hive world of murder and rot, and he found that the only thing that worked there, the only thing that made men behave, was to be more frightening than the dark they lived in. So he became more frightening than the dark. He hung the guilty from spires. He let the fear do the governing, and it worked. And the Emperor made him a legion, and the legion carried that method out across the stars. Arrive, terrify, break the will before the walls, and move on. It was, in the beginning, a kind of grim mercy. A world that surrenders in terror is a world that does not have to be burned. But an instrument built for terror has to be fed terror. And a legion of men trained from boyhood that fear is the mission ends up, over 10,000 years, with an appetite that has forgotten what it was for. The doctrine curdled. The mercy fell out of it. What is left, drifting the eastern fringe on stolen hulks, is not an army with a terror doctrine. It is a thing that eats terror and has learned to farm it. That is why they did not attack for 6 days. The attack was not the point. The attack was the harvest at the end of 6 days of careful cultivation, and every hour of that broadcast was them growing something in 11,000 people that they intended eventually to reap. Old Becker cut his own bead out of his ear on the 3rd day with a rock knife, rather than keep listening to it. He wasn't the only one. There was a particular cruelty in the 4th day that Marder has never been able to file anywhere in her head. The voice began taking requests. It said warmly that it had been talking a great deal and had not been a good guest, and that it would like to hear from Kalyx Deep, and that it had opened a channel. And it had. One of the Shaftcom circuits went live, 2-way, and the voice said it would listen to anyone who wished to speak, and that it was genuinely interested, and that it promised to answer honestly any question put to it. Nobody should have used it. Everybody knew nobody should use it, and of course people used it, because there were 11,000 people, and 6 days, and the human animal cannot leave an open door alone. They begged. Some of them bargained, offered the ore stocks, the machinery, offered to work, offered anything. Some of them threatened, which was worse to listen to. A woman named Hala Sim, whose 2 sons were on the surface watch, asked simply and directly whether her boys were alive, and the voice was quiet for a moment, and then said, with what sounded exactly like gentleness, "One of them is." And Hala Sim asked which, and the voice said, "I think it would be better for you to hope," and did not speak to her again, though she used that channel every hour for 2 days. That is the craft of it. That is what the 6 days were for. They were not laying siege to a colony. They were installing themselves in 11,000 heads, so thoroughly that when they finally came down, the people of Kalyx Deep would already be half-eaten before a single bolt was fired. Kalyx Deep had no defenses. I want to be plain about that, because the Imperium's records would later describe the loss of the colony in the language of military action, and there was no military action. There were 4 enforcers with shotguns and shock mauls whose entire professional life had been breaking up mash-still fights. There was a militia of about 200 miners with mining tools and 11 Las carbines between them, and Vaughn stood them up in the transfer deck and made a speech about the Emperor, and the militia listened, and Marder watched their faces and saw that every single one of them knew. There is a particular expression a man wears when he has understood that he is going to die, and that his dying will not accomplish anything. 200 of them wore it in the dark, holding rock drills. Vaughn did one decent thing at the end, and Marder has always made a point of saying so, because he was a small, grasping man who had skimmed her ration credit for 4 years, and he deserves the 1 line of credit the record can give him. On the 5th day, he came down to the 4th level in person, which he had not done in 11 years, and he found the shift bosses, and he told them, off the record, and against every standing order of the charter, to take their crews deep and not to come up, not to muster, not to report, not to obey the emergency assembly protocol that he himself was about to broadcast, because the emergency assembly protocol would put 4,000 people in the muster hall in one place at one time, and he had finally understood what that would mean. He was going to broadcast it anyway. He had to. It was in the charter, and there were enforcers, and there was a machine, and the machine had to be seen to run. But he stood in a rock tunnel at the 4th level and told 60 shift bosses to ignore him. Then he went up and did his duty and made his speech and stood with his militia on the transfer deck with a las pistol he had probably never fired, and the recording of the next 30 seconds exists, and Marder heard it years later and wished she had not. He does not sound brave on it. He sounds like a middle-aged administrator who is extremely frightened and is going through with it regardless, which is a different thing and, she came to think, a better one. They came on the 6th day. Marder was 3 kilometers underground when it started, which is the only reason she is in this story at all. She had taken her crew deep, not to work. Nobody was working. But because the deep shafts were the only place the voice didn't reach, the Vox repeaters not being rated below the 4th level, and she had marched 26 people down into the black just to give them 6 hours of silence. That was all she could do for them. That was the whole of her power as a shift boss at the edge of the universe. She could take her people somewhere quiet. She felt the first impact through 3 kilometers of rock. Everyone did. A single deep thud that came up through the soles of the boots, and then another, and then a rolling series of them, and the ancient shaft props groaned, and dust came down out of the dark in long, slow curtains. And Tam said, "Boss," in a voice that had gone very small and very young. They started up. It took 90 minutes to get to the 4th level, and at the 4th level, the Vox repeaters came back in, and that is where Marda Wren learned what was happening to her world, in the dark, from a speaker grill, standing in a rock tunnel with 26 people she had promised to bring back up. I am not going to give you all of it. There is a version of this story that lingers on the 6 hours the Night Lords spent in the habs of Kalyx Deep, and I will not tell that version, because it is exactly the version they would have wanted told. That was the whole purpose of the broadcast. They did not need the Vox to coordinate. They were 400 meters apart and had helm links. They broadcast because the horror was the harvest. Because a Night Lord's craft is not killing. Killing is trivial. Killing is what a lasgun does. Their craft is making a world listen while it happens, and then leaving enough alive to carry the story outward, so that the next world hears it before they ever arrive. Terror as a supply chain. That is the 8th Legion. That has been the 8th Legion since a world called Nostramo, 10,000 years ago, and everything they have done since has been in service of an idea their Primarch had about fear and order that curdled somewhere in the long dark into simple appetite. So, they broadcast. And in a rock tunnel on the 4th level, Marda's crew heard the colony they had been born in, taken apart in real time by something that narrated as it worked. What she remembers, and what she told the chapter serfs much later when they wanted the account, and she still had a tongue to give it with, is the pace. The unbearable leisure of it. They had all the time in the void and they used it. They took the transfer deck in 4 minutes. There is a recording of the militia's brave, pointless 30-second engagement, and Vaughan's voice on it, shrill, ordering a volley, and the sound the lasbolts made hitting ceramite, which is the sound of stones going into a pond, and then nothing for 2 hours. Then at leisure, the habs. Then at leisure, the shrine. And through it all, the voice, warm, interested, delighted, narrating, taking his time, and under his voice. This is the detail that Marda could never get out of her head. Under his voice you could hear the others, the rest of them, and they were laughing. Not madly, companionably, like men at a good meal. There is a thing about the 8th Legion that the survivors of Kalyx Deep worked out over those 6 days without anyone telling them, and it is the single most useful piece of intelligence in this whole account, and it cost them everything to learn. They can be disappointed. The voice's tone changed across the 6 days, in a way that everyone hiding in the shafts learned to read the way farmers read weather. When the colony reacted, when someone begged on the open channel, when a mother asked about her sons, when the militia formed up and made their pointless volley, the voice was warm and delighted and expansive. And when the colony went quiet, when whole hours passed with nobody using the channel and nothing to hear, the voice got thinner, petulant. It started repeating itself. It started twice to sound almost irritable, and once it stopped mid-sentence and said, in a completely different register, flat and bored, "You're not listening." That was the tell. That was the whole architecture of them, exposed for a second. They needed an audience. They were not simply killers who enjoyed their work. They were performers who required a room, and a room that will not respond starves them. Marda understood, down in the dark, in the worst week of her life, that the single most effective weapon 11,000 unarmed miners possessed against Astartes of the 8th Legion was to give them nothing. Not defiance, not courage, just silence, a wall of no reaction at all. She has thought about that a great deal since, given what came next. Because 6 days later a different kind of predator walked into Kalyx Deep, and the one thing that would have starved the Night Lords was the one thing the new arrivals did naturally, permanently, and without effort, and it did not weaken them in the slightest. There is your whole comparison in a sentence. Terror is a diet. The Carcharodons do not eat. They flayed. I have to say it once, plainly, and then leave it. The Night Lords flay and they hang and they arrange, and by the second day of the occupation of Kalyx Deep, the transfer deck and the smelter gantries and the great frozen shrine plaza had been made into something that the survivors who saw it from a distance would not describe, and the voice broadcast a running commentary on the arrangement as it was assembled, and asked several times, in a tone of genuine artistic interest, whether anyone still listening had any thoughts on the composition. She lost her first that same hour, and it was not to the enemy. His name was TITHE, 22, on her crew 4 years, and when the impact started, he simply turned and ran back down the tunnel toward the deep, away from the surface, away from the lift, into 3 kilometers of unlit, worked-out gallery. And he would not stop when she shouted, and he did not stop when the others shouted, and they heard him going for a long time, and then they did not. They never found him. Marder thinks about TITHE more than she thinks about most of the ones she lost, because he was the first thing that taught her the rule of that fortnight, which is that in a horror of that size, the enemy does perhaps half the killing, and the other half is done by ordinary people making one bad decision in one bad second because the animal in them took the wheel. She counted 25 off the lift that day. First time in 11 years. She has never talked about that either. Marder kept 25 people alive for 9 days in the deep shafts. That's not heroism. There's nothing heroic in it. It was rationing, and it was rock. She knew number 4 seam better than any living person because she'd spent 11 years in it. She knew the abandoned galleries, the flooded sections, the ventilation runs that hadn't been on a chart since the Mechanicus left, the places where the ancient survey maps were simply wrong. So when the raiding parties came down into the shafts, and they did on the 4th day, hunting, because a hunt is more entertaining than a slaughter, she moved her people through the parts of the seam that weren't on any map, and she counted them over and over in the dark, and for 9 days she did not come up short. They took Iska on the 9th day. Iska Vel, who had been Marder's friend since they were girls in the Habskola, who had a laugh like a broken bell, and who was the last of Marder's crew to still be making jokes. She went back for the water jugs at a cistern they'd used twice, which was a stupid thing, which she knew was stupid, and she went anyway because there were children with them, and children need water. There was no fight. There was no scream. There was just the small wet sound of the cistern gallery, 400 meters back down the tunnel, and then the voice, in the repeaters, warm and delighted, saying, "Oh, hello. Now here's a brave one. Marder Wren, I think this one might be yours. Would you like to come and get her? Take your time. We've all the time there is." They kept Iska alive for 2 days on the Vox. I will not describe those 2 days. I will describe what they did to the 25 people in the tunnel, because that is the part that matters and the part the Night Lords intended. It broke the group, not into panic, into factions. By the end of the first day, there were 6 people who wanted to go and get her, who could not physically sit in the dark and listen to it, and there were 9 who wanted to move deeper immediately and put 400 meters of rock between themselves and the sound, and there were the rest who wanted to smash the repeater, and Marder had to hold all of that together in the black with her voice and her hands and nothing else. She let them smash the repeater on the 2nd day. It didn't help. The sound came down the ventilation runs from the 4th level anyway, thinned and distant, which was somehow worse. And then it stopped, and the silence was worse again, because everyone knew what the silence meant. And here is what she understood, sitting in the dark afterward, with her arms round her knees and Tam asleep against her shoulder. They had not kept Iska alive for 2 days. because they wanted anything from Iska. Iska had nothing to tell them. The colony's defenses had been over in 4 minutes. There was no intelligence, no resistance to break, no purpose whatsoever in it. They had done it because 25 people in a tunnel could hear it, and because those 25 would, if they lived, tell somebody, and because a story like that goes further than a bolt round ever could. Iska Vel was not a prisoner. She was a broadcast, and that is the exact and total sum of what the 8th Legion has become in 10,000 years. An organism that converts human beings into the fear of human beings and eats the difference. Marder made herself remember that. She has said since that it was the only thing that kept her sane in the deep, holding on to the idea that there was a reason, that this was a method, that the thing doing it wanted something and was therefore a thing and not a force of nature. You can hate a method. You can survive to spite a method. She held that thought for 9 days like a coal in her fist. It did not prepare her at all for what came next, because the thing that came next did not want anything. That is what the Night Lords are, and I have given you this much of it only so that you will understand the thing that happens next, and understand it correctly. Because on the 11th day, in the middle of a sentence, the voice stopped. It had not stopped in 11 days. It had not stopped for 11 days, and the survivors in the deep shafts had come to live inside that sound the way you live, inside weather. And it stopped, mid-word, and the silence that came down on Kalyx Deep was so total and so sudden that half of them thought they'd gone deaf. It came back 40 minutes later, and the survivors in the dark below, huddled around a repeater grill they'd propped on a rock, heard the warm, cultured voice that had spent 11 days describing what it was doing to their families say, in a completely different register, in a tone none of them had heard from it before. No, that's not. Brothers, I have 3 signals in the smelter district, and they are not registering as... A pause. A sound Marder could not identify then, and understood perfectly later. The sound of ceramide moving fast in an enclosed space, and nothing else. No shot, no shout. And then the voice again, and it was still smiling. She would swear it was still smiling, but underneath the smile there was something new, something raw, and the words came fast now, and it said, "They're in the dark. They're in the dark with us, and they're not making any sound. Get to the ships, get to the..." And Kalyx Deep went quiet. 26 people in a black rock tunnel 3 kilometers down held their breath and listened to 11 days of horror simply stop. Baker was the only one who did not celebrate. The rest of them wept or laughed or prayed. 25 people in a black tunnel 3 kilometers down, hearing 11 days of horror stop mid-word, and the relief that came off them was so violent that 2 of them were sick with it. Somebody started the litany, and this time the whole tunnel joined, properly, meaning every word. Marder held Tam's shoulder and found her own face was wet and did not remember when that had started. And old Becker sat with his back against the rock and did not join in. And when Marder finally noticed and asked him what was wrong with him, he said, and she has never forgotten the flatness of it, or the fact that he was 71 years old and had been right about every single thing since the day the Hulk appeared. Girl, think about what you just heard. He tipped his head at the smashed repeater. That was a Legion Astartes, 10,000 years old. Been killing people since before this rock had a name on it. And in the last 4 seconds he wasn't taunting us, and he wasn't giving orders. Becker looked up at her in the dark. He was begging his brothers to run. Nobody said anything for a while after that. And Tam, 15 years old, whispered into the dark, "Boss, Boss, does that mean somebody's come? Chapter 3. The Silence. Nobody on Kalyx Deep ever saw the ship. Marder spent 19 years aboard it and never once saw the outside of it. And the only description she ever got was from a serf who had been on an external work party in a void suit and who signed when she asked that it was long and dark and there are no lights on the outside of her at all. Not dimmed, none. A void ship the size of a mountain range running utterly dark through the black. No running lights, no beacons. Nothing an auger would catch that wasn't already looking for it. The Carcharodons had not so much arrived in the Kalyx system as been present in it at some point, without anyone establishing when. The Night Lords had held that system for a fortnight, with 3 raider craft and an orbital watch. And they were not fools. And their augers were better than anything Kalyx had. And they had detected nothing. That is the part the TITHE ship adepts refused to believe when the survivors were finally debriefed. And it is the part Marder always insisted on hardest. The 8th Legion did not fight a battle in orbit and lose it. There was no orbital engagement. The first thing the Night Lords knew was 3 unidentified signals in the smelter district. And then, 40 minutes later, nothing. Whatever the Nitkor is, and however she moves, she had come across the outer dark and into a defended system and put boarding parties on the ground without a single one of the galaxy's most paranoid raiders noticing. And then the killing had started in the dark, and then it had finished. They had come without a hail. That is the first thing, and it is the thing that every account of the Carcharodons Astra begins with and never adequately explains, because it is not a tactic and it is not a courtesy withheld. It is simply what they are. There was no Vox transmission to Kalyx Deep, no imperial identification, no demand for surrender, no declaration of intent, no announcement to the Astartes of the 8th Legion that judgment had arrived. There is no record anywhere in the Imperium's archives of the Carcharodons ever having announced themselves to anyone. They arrived in the Kalyx system on a vessel that gave off almost no emissions, in a system with no functioning auger array to have detected it anyway, and the first any living thing knew of their presence was when the Night Lords in the smelter district stopped existing. Marder took her people up. That was a decision, and she has never been sure it was hers, and she has never stopped turning it over. 11 days of hiding, and the horror stops, and something in you, something that isn't sense, needs to see. She left 20 of them at the 4th level with Becca, and she took 5 up the ventilation run to the surface galleries, Tam among them because he would not be left, and they came out through a maintenance hatch onto the high catwalk above the ore processing floor at the exact wrong moment, which was also the only moment that mattered. The processing floor was 200 meters across and roofed in armor glass and lit that night, only by the red emergency lumens the Night Lords had left burning, because they liked the color. There were 9 Night Lords on it. Marder had never seen one clearly, and she saw them then, all 9, and they were enormous, and they were beautiful in the way a knife is beautiful. Midnight blue ceramite trimmed in bone and bronze, winged helms, lightning clawed, and hung all over with things that had recently been the people she had grown up with. They were not laughing now. They had formed a firing line facing the northern conveyor gantry, and they were shooting into the dark beyond it, and their bolters made a noise in that enclosed space like the world ending. Marder flattened herself on the catwalk grating and looked down through it and understood, slowly, that they were shooting at nothing. There was nothing beyond the gantry. There was dark, and the dark was empty, and 9 of the galaxy's most accomplished murderers were pouring mass reactive rounds into it as fast as their weapons would cycle. The bolters stopped, one at a time, as they ran dry. and in the ringing silence afterward, something came out of the dark on the left, where nobody was looking, moving faster than Marder's eye could follow, and took the leftmost Night Lord's head off his shoulders with a blade she never saw. Here is what the Night Lords did in those 40 seconds, and it is the most useful testimony in this entire account, because these were not frightened miners. These were Astartes of the 8th Legion, veterans of a raiding war band that had been terrorizing the Fringe for longer than Kalyx Deep had existed. Transhuman killers with 10,000 years of doctrine behind them, and no capacity for fear as you or I would understand it. They panicked. Marder saw it from above and did not have the training to name what she was seeing, but she saw it. She saw them break formation without orders. She saw 2 of them fire on a third's position in the dark. She saw one, an enormous one, clawed, crested, the one who had been giving the orders, turn a full circle in the middle of the floor with his bolter up, turning and turning, hunting for something to shoot, and there was nothing to shoot. And she watched a creature bred and built and sworn to be the most frightening thing in the galaxy stand in a red-lit room and discover that something else had walked in, and she heard them shouting all the way through. The Night Lords shouted the entire 40 seconds. Warnings, positions, one long stream of Vox traffic, and then at the end, from the last one, something in a language she didn't know, high and fast and rising. And underneath all that shouting, the thing killing them made no sound whatsoever. And that contrast is the whole of what I want you to take out of this chapter. One species of predator announces itself, because announcing is how it feeds. The other does not announce itself, because it has no use for you being afraid. It only has a use for you being dead, and dead does not require a preamble. She has tried to describe this many times. She has never been able to make it sound like what it was, because every word for combat is a loud word. Clash, charge, roar, and there was no sound. That is the thing. The Carcharodons killed 9 Astartes of the Night Lords on the ore processing floor of Kalyx Deep in approximately 40 seconds, and in those 40 seconds, they did not make one single sound that was not the sound of ceramite striking ceramite and blades going into bodies. No war cry, no vox chatter, no orders, nothing. They came out of the dark from 3 directions at once, perfectly coordinated, without a word spoken between them, and they moved through the Night Lords, the way something moves through water, and the only voices on that floor were the Night Lords, shouting to each other, shouting warnings, and at the end, one of them screaming, and the screaming stopped, and then there was nothing at all. And Marder Wren lay on the catwalk in the dark above with her hand over Tam's mouth and understood that she had just watched a hunt. Then they went still, and she got her first proper look at them, and that is when the shape of the horror changed. They were not like the Night Lords. That was the thing her eye kept insisting on. Where the 8th Legion were ornate, the trophies, the trim, the winged helms, all of it designed, all of it saying something, these were plain to the point of ugliness. Their plate was the color of old bone and dried blood, grey-white and rust-red, and it was ancient. Marder knew nothing about the marks of Astartes' armor, but old Becker had spent 50 years around Mechanicus survey gear, and he would tell her later, when she described it, what she had been looking at, Mark V. The pattern they'd hammered out 10,000 years ago in the middle of the heresy, when the forges were failing and the legions were making do. Plates studded all over with rows of crude bonding studs, big rivets driven into the ceramite to hold reinforcing plates, a field expedient design from the worst years of human history that had gone out of production before the Imperium, as anyone now understood it even existed, and they were wearing it. Not one suit, all of them. repaired and re-repaired and welded and patched so many times over so many centuries that in places you could not tell what the original plate had been. All of it scored and pitted and scarred, each suit hung with teeth. Actual teeth, some of them the size of a man's hand, and marked with a jawed, toothed sigil that Marder would see in her sleep for the rest of her life. She had time to look at the armor because they had gone still, and she was terrified. And terror does that. It gives you an unwanted, unbearable clarity, and you find yourself noticing the pattern on the rivets of the thing that is about to decide whether you live. The plate was covered in studs. That was what her eye kept snagging on. Rows of them, big crude rivets standing proud of the ceramite along the shoulders and the chest and down the greaves, dozens on every suit, in ordered lines like stitching. It looked wrong. It looked unfinished, the way a thing looks when it has been hammered together in a hurry by someone who did not have the proper parts. And that, Becca told her much later. Becca, who had spent 50 years handling Mechanicus survey gear and had opinions about metal, was exactly what it was. That mark of plate was designed in an emergency. 10,000 years ago, in a war that split the species in half, the forges were failing and the legions could not get replacement armor. So they made a pattern that could be repaired in the field by riveting reinforcement plates over damage, bonding studs, a stopgap, a pattern of armor that was supposed to last until the crisis ended. The crisis ended 10,000 years ago, and these were still wearing it. Not as a relic, not ceremonially. Wearing it, using it, patched and repatched. Some of the studs clearly hammered in centuries after others. Whole panels replaced with metal that didn't match. 100 generations of field repair layered over a design that was itself a field repair. Marder understood, lying on that grating, what she was actually looking at. Men who had gone out past the light with what they had, and had never once come back to be re-equipped, and had simply kept going for 10,000 years, mending the same suits, because there was nobody out there to issue them new ones. And they were hung with teeth. She had thought it was ornament. It was not ornament in the way the Night Lord's trophies were ornament. There was nothing displayed about it, nothing arranged. Teeth were bound to their plate with wire in ugly practical clusters. Great triangular serrated teeth the size of her palm. Hundreds of them across the 9 of them. Some yellowed with age, some new. She never learned what they came from. She never learned whether they were trophies or tools or prayers. And when she asked years later in hand signs, the old surfmaster signed back a single gesture that meant ours and would not elaborate. And then one of them took his helm off, and Marder Wren saw the face of the thing that had saved her world. It was a man's face, and it was not. The skin was white, not pale, white. The flat chalk white of something that has never in its life been under a sun, marbled with faint blue veining at the temple, and it was covered in scars that were not battle scars. They were deliberate, ritual, rows of fine cuts, healed and recut and healed again, running along the jaw and the cheekbone in a pattern with the ordered look of language. The face was gaunt and hollow-cheeked, and there was nothing in the arrangement of it at all. No anger, no triumph, no exertion. He had just killed 9 Astartes, and his face was as empty as the floor he was standing on. And the eyes were black. Entirely black. No white, no iris. 2 flat wet spheres of absolute black in a chalk-white face, and they moved, scanning the dark of the processing floor. And Marder understood with a lurch that turned her stomach that he could see. All of them could. They had come through a pitch-black smelter district and hunted 9 armored killers through unlit industrial space, and they had not used a single lamp, and they were not using one now. They saw perfectly in the dark. The dark was theirs. It was where they lived. and she was lying on a catwalk 20 meters above him, in what she had believed was safe blackness, and it was not black to him at all, and she had the sudden, vertiginous certainty, she never learned whether it was true, that he knew precisely where she was, and had known since before he came onto the floor, and that she was simply not, at this moment, relevant. One of them was still killing. That is the part she was least prepared for, and the part that told her most. 8 of them had gone still the instant the last Night Lord fell, gone from that impossible speed to complete immobility in a heartbeat, standing in the red light like statuary. The 9th had not stopped. He was crouched over a Night Lord that had been dead for some while, and he was still going, methodically, with a blade in each hand, and the sounds he was making were the only sounds in that whole vast room. A wet, rhythmic working, and, under it, a low sound in his chest that was not a word and not a growl, and not anything Marder had a name for. The others did nothing. That was the horror of it. No one restrained him. No one shouted. No one seemed remotely surprised. 2 of them turned their heads to watch, without expression, the way you'd glance at a dog worrying a bone, and then turn back to their sweep. They simply waited. They waited a full minute, perhaps 2, while their brother took apart a corpse with his hands, and when the low sound in his chest finally stopped, and he rose and stood swaying, one of them, the one with the bare head, the one with the language cut into his face, walked over and put a hand flat on his brother's breastplate and held it there for a moment. Not a comfort, not a rebuke, a steadying. The way you'd put a hand on a machine to feel whether it had settled. Marder came to know what that was, eventually, though nobody aboard the Nicor would ever put a name to it in her hearing. The serfs had a hand sign for it. It was made low at the belly, and it meant something like the red comes up, and you made it the way you would make a sign for weather, not for a moral failing, not for a possession or a madness, but for a condition that arrives. She learned that the surf gangs watched for it, the way people on a coast watch a sky. She learned that there were places aboard ship you did not go when a company came back from an action, and that the reason was never stated, and that the older serfs would put a hand on a new one's arm and steer them down a different corridor without explanation. What she saw on that processing floor was the thing every account of that chapter circles and never lands on. That underneath the silence and the terrible discipline, there is something in them that is not disciplined at all, that is very old and very simple, and that the discipline exists precisely because of it. They are not cold because they feel nothing. They are cold the way a lid is cold, and when it comes off, when the killing goes on long enough, or the blood is deep enough, or whatever the trigger is that no outsider will ever be told, a thing comes up in one of them that has no strategy and no purpose, and does not stop when the enemy is dead, and the others do not intervene, and they do not seem to judge, because it is in all of them, and they all know it. They simply wait it out. They stand there like men waiting for rain to pass, and then one of them puts a hand flat on their brother's chest to see if he has come back, and then they go on. That is the thing Marder could never make the TITHE ship adepts understand when they debriefed the survivors of Kalyx Deep years later, in the one interview she gave before the Nicor claimed her. They kept asking her whether the Astartes had been in control, and she kept trying to explain that this was the wrong question, that control was not the opposite of what she had seen, that the 2 of them were the same animal, that the terrible flat calm and the wet red frenzy were not a soldier, and his lapse but a predator holding still and a predator moving, and that a shark is not out of control when it bites. And then they went back to work, all 9, in silence, as though nothing whatsoever had occurred. Marda Ren had grown up in the Imperial Creed, the way everyone does at the bottom of the Imperium. Deacon Halvers and the Plaster Aquila and the litanies you say without hearing. She knew what the angels of the Emperor were. Everyone knows. They are in every devotional plate on every hab wall on every world. Golden, radiant, haloed. The Emperor's own sons come down to lift the faithful out of the dark. Every child on Kalyx Deep had a picture of one in their head. She lay on the catwalk and looked down at 9 white-faced, black-eyed things in 10,000-year-old rivet-studded plate, standing utterly silent among the pieces of the monsters they had just dismantled. And she understood that the picture in her head had been a lie told to children, and that the truth had just walked into her world out of the outer dark, and that the truth did not care whether she lived or died, and had not come here for her at all. And then she noticed what they were doing, and it was worse than the killing, and it is the thing she would give as her testimony if she could only give one. They were searching the bodies, not looting. There was nothing methodical about desecration in it, no trophies taken, none of the ritual that the Night Lords had made of their own dead enemies. 2 of them went along the line of corpses and opened the plate at the chest and the throat with practiced economy, working fast, checking something, and where they found what they were looking for, they cut it out and put it into a sealed flask that a 3rd carried. Marda did not know then, and knows now, gene seed. The organs the Astartes grow that make more Astartes. They were harvesting them from the dead of the 8th Legion, from heretics, from the Emperor's enemies, from corrupted stock a decent chapter would have burned. Because out there past the light, where nothing is resupplied and nothing is replaced, you take what the dark gives you, and you ask the question afterward, or you do not ask it at all. That was the moment. She always said that was the moment, before the tithe, before the hall, before Tam, not the pale faces, not the black eyes, not the silence. It was watching them go down the line of their own kind's corpses with knives and a flask, quickly, without ceremony. The way she and her crew went along a played-out gallery, pulling out anything worth salvage before they sealed it. An understanding in her gut before her mind would let her say it, that she had not been saved by soldiers. She had been standing on a seam, and something had come to work it. One of them signed. That was the last thing she saw before Tam spoke, and it is the detail that stayed with her longest because of what it turned out to mean. The bare-headed one made a short gesture with 2 fingers, a small, economical movement, down and out, and 3 of the others immediately broke off and moved toward the eastern conveyor, and not one word had passed between them. Marda, lying on a catwalk above them, did not know then that she was looking at a language. She would spend 19 years learning it. She would learn, eventually, that the sign he made that night was the one that means sweep and clear, and that she would see it perhaps 1,000 times, and that the first time she ever saw it, she had been a free woman lying in the dark, watching what she believed were angels. She would also learn, and this took her years, and it is the thing she found hardest to accept, that the silence is not discipline. She had assumed it was. A doctrine, a trained restraint, warriors mastering themselves. It is not. Down in the surf decks, the older hands were clear about it in signs, and they were not being poetic. The Carcharodons do not speak because there is no longer anybody for them to speak to. They speak to each other with their hands. They do not speak to the Imperium because they have not been given an order by the Imperium in living memory. They do not speak to their serfs because their serfs have no tongues. They do not speak to the people they save because the people they save are cargo. Somewhere across 10,000 years of the outer dark, A chapter of the Adeptus Astartes ran out of anyone to talk to and simply stopped. And what everybody now takes for terrifying discipline is really just the shape a voice leaves behind when there has been nothing to say it to for 100 centuries. "Boss!" Tam breathed, right against her ear. And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard in 11 days, and it took her a moment to recognize it as hope. "Boss, they're ours. They came for us." She did not answer him. She could not. Because down on the floor, the bare-headed one had finished with the corpses and had gone still again. And he was standing in the red light doing nothing whatsoever. And Marder was close enough to see his chest under the ancient studded plate. And it was not moving. She watched for a long count. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing. No breath. No shift of weight. No small unconscious adjustment. None of the 1,000 tiny movements a living body makes when it is standing still and thinks nobody is looking. He simply stopped, entirely, the way a machine stops, and stayed stopped, and would clearly have stayed stopped for as long as it took. She had grown up around men who worked in the dark. She knew what a man looks like waiting at a shaft head. This was not that. There was no waiting in it, no impatience, no boredom, nothing being endured. It was the stillness of something that does not experience the passage of time as a cost, that can hold absolutely motionless in a black room for an hour or a week and lose nothing by it, because it is not going anywhere and has not been going anywhere for 10,000 years. Deep water, she thought, without knowing why. Years before she ever learned that the serfs had a sign for exactly that. That's what a thing looks like at the bottom of deep water, and down on the processing floor, without any of them appearing to give a signal. All 9 turned at once and looked up at the catwalk. Chapter 4. The Red Tithe. They did not kill them. Marder has always felt she should begin with that, because of how she felt in the 2 seconds after those 9 black-eyed heads turned up toward her, which was that she was already dead. They did not kill them. They came up. 3 of them so fast up a maintenance ladder that no armored thing that size should have been able to climb, and they took the 5 survivors off the catwalk without a word. Took them physically, 1 in each hand where they had to, the way you'd carry tools, and they did not answer a single question. Marder asked. She was shift boss enough to ask even then, with her feet off the ground and a hand round her arm that could have closed. "Who are you? Is the colony secure? There are 20 more of my people on the 4th level. Are there any more of them? Please. Please, are there any more of the ones with the wings?" Nothing. Not a word, not a glance, not the smallest indication that a thing had spoken. She might have been cargo. She was cargo. They put the 5 of them in the muster hall with the others. There were 416. That was what was left of 11,000. 416 people, found in the deep shafts and the ventilation runs and the flooded galleries and the maintenance crawls, and brought up in silence over 2 days, and put in the muster hall where Overseer Vaughn had once made his speech about the Emperor's Charter. 20 of them were Marders. Becca had brought them up when the Astartes came down the shaft. He told her he'd looked at them coming out of the dark and simply put his tools down, and that every man with him had done the same, because there is a level of predator in front of which the animal in you does not even consider running. The Carcharodons put them in the hall and shut the doors and posted no guard, because none was needed. And then, for 11 hours, they did nothing. That was the beginning of Marder's real education. 11 hours. 416 survivors of a massacre, most of them injured, all of them starving, sitting on the floor of a cold hall in the dark. And nobody came. No medici, no rations, No water, no word. They could hear activity outside, the movement of heavy things, engines, the crash of the great cargo doors. But nothing came in, and nobody explained anything. And by the 8th hour, a woman near the doors had started screaming and could not be made to stop. And by the 10th hour, the mood in the hall had changed from relief to something much worse. And old Becca said quietly, to nobody, the thing that turned out to be exactly right. They're not here for us. They're doing an inventory. You have to understand what those 11 hours did, because they did more damage than the Night Lord's 6 days. For 6 days, the 8th Legion had spoken to Kalyx Deep continuously, and the speaking was torture, and everyone in that hall would have told you it was the worst thing that had ever happened to them. And then something arrived that would not speak to them at all, and within 11 hours, the survivors of Kalyx Deep discovered that being addressed by a monster is a kind of relationship, and that having no relationship at all is worse. They tried everything. That is the part Marder found hardest to watch. 416 human beings in a cold hall, trying every social instrument the species has. They knocked on the doors politely, then hard, then with a bench. They shouted questions, then demands, then apologies. Apologies, as if they had given offense, as if the silence must be a rebuke, and they only had to work out what for. Someone started a litany, and half the hall joined it, and they sang the Emperor's praises loudly enough to be heard through steel, because if these were the Emperor's angels, then surely a hymn would reach them. Nothing. A woman held her dead husband's identities tags up at the door slit and explained over and over, in a level, reasonable voice, who he had been and what he had done and why somebody ought to be told. Nothing. A group of the militia survivors organized themselves and reported formally, by rank, through the door, offering their service to the Imperium and requesting orders. Nothing. By the 8th hour, the hall had stopped talking to the door and started talking to itself, and Marder listened to 400 people build, in real time, out of nothing, an entire theology of why the silence was actually good. They're securing the perimeter. They're prioritizing the wounded elsewhere. They don't speak our dialect. They've sent for a ship. They're waiting for orders. The Emperor's angels have their own ways, and it is not for us to question. She listened to people reason themselves into calm using material they were manufacturing on the spot. She did it herself for a while and caught herself at it and stopped. And that was the moment Marder Wren began to be genuinely afraid, in a way the Night Lords had never managed. Because the Night Lords had told her exactly what they were. This thing told her nothing, and into that nothing her own mind kept pouring hope. And she understood that the hope was coming out of her, not out of them, and that a thing which gives you no information at all lets you build your own coffin. Becca didn't build one. Becca sat against the wall with his eyes shut, and when Marder came and sat by him, he said, without opening them, "Girl, what's the first thing you do when you take on a new seam?" "Assay it," she said. "Aye," said Becca. "You don't talk to a seam. You don't explain yourself to it. You go in, you look at it, you work out what's worth taking and what isn't, and then you take it." He opened his eyes. 11 hours, girl. Nobody's come. Nobody's asked us anything. Nobody's told us anything. He tipped his head at the doors. "That's not a rescue. That's an assay." The doors opened on the 11th hour, and the serfs came in. Marder had expected Astartes. What came in were men, ordinary men, or near enough. A work gang of perhaps 40 in heavy rebreathers and quilted void thermals, moving fast and efficiently with medica kits and ration crates and water. They were human beings, and the survivors of Kalyx Deep nearly wept at the sight of them and swarmed them, and asked them 100 desperate questions all at once. What's happening? Where's the Imperium? Is there a ship? Are you taking us off? Is my son on the list? And the serfs did not answer. Not one. They worked quickly and gently and competently, and they did not answer. And it took Marder a long minute of shouting into a man's face to understand why. He opened his mouth to show her. They had no tongues, every one of them. Marder has never known whether it was done to them or whether they had done it themselves as some rite of service, and she came to suspect that the distinction in the place they served did not exist. 40 mute men with the stumps of their tongues, moving among the survivors with water and bandages, and every one of them scarred. The same fine-ordered ritual cuts she had seen on the white face on the processing floor, cut into human cheeks and jaws, a language written on servants by masters who did not speak. One of them, an older man, met Marder's eyes while he was splinting Tam's wrist, and she saw in his face, because he had a face, because he was still human enough to have one, a thing she has never been able to unsee. She saw pity. He looked at the survivors of Kalyx Deep, at their gratitude, at the way they were thanking him and blessing the Emperor and telling each other it was over now. And he looked at them the way you look at something that hasn't been told yet. And then he finished the splint and moved on and would not meet her eyes again. The tithe began on the second day. They did not call it that. They did not call it anything. They did not explain, then or ever. What happened was that the doors opened, and a serf scribe came in with a slate, and the survivors were made to file past, one at a time, and be looked at. And the looking was done by one of them. He stood by the doors, the bare-headed one, the one with the language cut into his face. And Marder learned later from the serf's hand signs that his rank word rendered as something like Reva Prime, and that his name was Ngaru. And that was the sum total of what she ever learned about him. He looked at each survivor as they passed. Nothing more. He did not touch them, did not speak, did not ask a question. Black Eyes moved over a human being for perhaps 2 seconds, and then he made one of 3 small gestures with 2 fingers, and the serf scribe marked the slate, and the person was moved to one of 3 groups at the far end of the hall. It took 4 hours to sort 416 people into 3 groups, and by the end of it, every soul in that hall understood what the groups were, and the understanding came over them in a slow, spreading silence that was worse than the screaming had been. The first group was small, 31 people, all of them young, the youngest 14, the oldest perhaps 19, and all of them, Marder noticed, the same kind of young, hard, fast, quick-eyed, the ones who had survived 11 days in the dark by being good at it. Tam was in the first group. Ngaru had looked at him for 2 seconds and made a gesture, and a serf had taken the boy's shoulder and moved him, and Marder had gone after him and been stopped by a mute serf who put both hands flat on her chest and shook his head over and over with an urgency that was the closest thing to speech anyone had offered her in 3 days. The second group was the largest, 260-odd adults, the strong ones, the ones with trades, machinists, rig hands, medici orderlies, the deep shaft crews. Marder was put in the second group. So was Becca at 71, which told her that whatever the criterion was, it was not simply youth. The third group was everyone else. The old, the maimed, the sick, the 2 women heavily pregnant, the children under 10. 125 people sat down at the north end of the hall. Marder has thought about the criteria for 19 years, and this is the best she ever managed. It was not strength exactly. Becca at 71 went into the second group, and a man of 30 with a crushed hand went into the third. It was not youth. There were people of 50 in the second group. What it looked like, when she finally found the shape of it, was usefulness measured over time. Will this body do work on a ship for a decade? Will this body survive the surgeries? Will this body cost more to feed than it returns? Becca went into the second group because Becca had 50 years of trade in his hands and would be useful in a machine shop until the day he dropped. The man with the crushed hand went into the third because a hand that will not close is a hand that cannot haul, and there is no Medikey aboard a fleet like that for repairing serfs. And the third group was not condemned. And that is the detail that people always get wrong when they hear this story, and it is somehow worse than the version where they are. The Carcharodons did not kill the third group. They did not touch them. They had no interest in them at all. No malice, no mercy, no execution, nothing. They simply did not take them, the way you do not take the parts of an ore seam that are, say, below grade. And then they stripped the colony of everything that would keep a person alive and left 125 of the old, the maimed, the pregnant, and the very young, alive and unharmed on a frozen rock with no water reclamation, no Medikey stores, no Prometheum, no beacon, no astropath, and no ship. 6 years before the next scheduled contact, they were not murdered. They were left over. Marder has never been able to decide which word she hates more. Nobody had said a word. That is what Marder could never make anyone understand afterward. Nobody had explained anything. Nobody had made a demand. Nobody had issued so much as a threat. And 416 human beings sat in a cold hall at the edge of the galaxy and worked out entirely without assistance, from nothing but 2-second glances and small gestures of 2 fingers. Exactly what was being done to them, and exactly what the third group was. Nobody ever told the survivors of Kalyx Deep what had happened to their world. And that omission was not an oversight. It was total. Marder spent 19 years aboard the Nikor and was never once, by anyone, informed that the Night Lords had been destroyed, that the colony had been relieved, that she had been rescued, that the Imperium had prevailed, or that anything whatsoever had occurred. There was no announcement to the survivors. There was no announcement to the Imperium either. No report filed, no astropathic dispatch, no entry in any Munitorum ledger, anywhere recording that a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes had engaged and annihilated a 8th Legion raiding warband at Kalyx Deep. The Imperium does not know it happened. 6 years later, a TITHE ship arrived on schedule, found a stripped colony and 100 and something bodies, and filed the loss as heretical raiding action. All hands. That is the only official record of any of this that exists. They do not report. They do not claim credit. They do not tell you they saved you, because it does not occur to them that this is information you are owed, any more than it occurs to a shark to explain itself to the water. There was no announcement. There was no ceremony. On the third day, the second group was marched out to the landing field and loaded into bulk lifters, and the first group was taken separately, and the third group was left in the muster hall with the doors open, and the Carcharodons simply went. They took the sable iron too. They had spent 3 days stripping the smelter reserve and the raw stocks and anything else the colony had that could be lifted, and they had taken the colony's Prometheum and its water reclamation cores and its Medica supplies, and they left 125 people alive on a world with no beacon, no supplies, no ships, no astropath, and a decadal TITHE ship due in 6 years. The loading took 9 hours, and it was the most orderly thing Marder had ever been part of. And the orderliness was its own obscenity. Surf gangs worked the ramps with hand signs and hooks. The bulk lifters came down and went up and came down again on a schedule you could have set a shift clock by. Ore went up in one stream and people went up in another, and there was no difference at all in how the two streams were handled. The same gangs, the same cadence, the same total absence of comment. Marder stood in the queue and watched a surf master direct a pallet of sable iron, and then, with the identical gesture, direct 40 human beings, and understood that in the accounting of the thing she was now inside, there was no category difference between the two. Both were what the world had yielded. Both went in the hold. Nobody resisted at the end. That is worth setting down, because people always ask. 400 people, most of them miners, hard people with tools, and there was no rising, no last stand, not so much as a thrown rock. Partly it was the 11 days that had come before. The Night Lords had already taken everything out of them that a rising is made of. But mostly it was that there was nothing to rise against. You cannot mutiny against a silence. There was no officer to defy, no demand to refuse, no speech to shout down, no enemy who had ever once acknowledged that you existed. They were simply moved, gently and efficiently, by mute men who would not meet their eyes, under the flat black gaze of things that had never spoken to them, onto ships that took them into the dark. Marder has said that it was less like being captured than like being weather-swept, like being a thing on a beach when the tide decides. That is the red tithe. That is the thing the Imperium's records, on the rare occasions they acknowledge the Carcharodons Astra exist at all, describe in language so bloodless that you could read it a dozen times and not see the blood in it. The chapter maintains itself through periodic levy upon isolated human populations at the galactic fringe. They take people. They take the strong to crew their ships and work their forges and die in their service, mute and scarred. They take the young and the fast and the hard to be broken down and rebuilt into more of themselves. And they take everything else that isn't nailed down because they have no homeworld and no forge and no supply chain and no Imperium behind them, out there in the outer dark, past the last light of the Astronomican, and a fleet that has been sailing without a port for 10,000 years feeds the only way anything feeds out there, which is by hunting. Marder fought them. I want that recorded, because she was 41 and had a bad shoulder, and it made no difference at all, and she did it anyway. When they came to move the second group, she went for the boy, pushed through the line and got about 4 meters, and got a hand on Tam's sleeve, actually got a hand on him, and screamed into the face of the nearest Astartes every word she had. That he was 15, that his parents were dead, that she was responsible for him, that he was hers, that she had put him on her roster and falsified his age and paid Vaughn 4 years of ration credit and brought him up the shaft alive 9 days running, that she had never once come up short, not once in 11 years, and that they could not have him. The Astartes looked down at her. That was all. He did not strike her. He did not speak. He looked down at her for perhaps a second and a half with those flat black eyes, and there was nothing in them, not anger, not contempt, not even interest. And Marder Wren, who had faced down rockfalls and gang bosses and 11 days of the Night Lord's voice, felt something go out of her at the bottom of her spine that has never come back, because there was nothing there to appeal to. The Night Lords had wanted something from her. The whole 11 days had been a conversation, foul and one-sided, but a conversation. One predator communicating with prey it valued for its terror. This thing wanted nothing from her. She was not being hated or savored or punished. She was a noise near a task. He turned away, and a mute serf took her arm, gently, and led her back into the line, and she let him. And that is the part she has never forgiven herself for, and the part I would ask you not to judge her for. The old serf, the one who had splinted Tam's wrist, the one who had looked at them with pity, found her in the loading queue an hour later. He could not speak, and she could not yet read the signs, and so he did the only thing available to him. He took her hand, and he turned it palm up, and with one finger he wrote on her palm, slowly, in letters, 3 words. Marda Wren could read. Not everyone on Kalyx could, but she had been a shift boss, and shift bosses keep rosters. She stood in the loading queue in the cold, with a mute stranger writing on her hand, and what he wrote was, "They come back." She stared at him. He nodded, urgently, and wrote it again, and then a third word after it that took him a long time and several restarts, because his hand was shaking. Sometimes. And then he let go and moved on down the line, and that was the most anyone aboard that fleet ever gave her, and she carried it for 19 years. They come back. Sometimes. She understood it 3 ways, and never settled on one. That the taken sometimes return to the fleet from the aspirant trials alive. That the chapter sometimes returns to the worlds it has tithed. Or that this was simply the only comfort a mute man had left to give a woman about to lose a boy. The thin, cold hope that some fraction of what is taken is not gone forever, offered by someone who had almost certainly been standing where she was standing, on some other rock, a very long time ago. She thought about it every day of her life on the Nicor. She was still thinking about it 17 years later, on the embarkation deck when she looked up. She saw Tam once more. The first group went aboard a separate lifter, and as she was marched past, he was standing at the ramp between 2 Astartes with the 30 other chosen, and he had that look on his face. That terrible, bright, 15-year-old look. Because he had been chosen, do you see? He had been selected, out of 11,000, by the angels of the Emperor, and no one had told him what for. "Boss!" he shouted. He was grinning. He was actually grinning. "Boss, they picked me! They picked me!" She has gone over the 3 seconds she had, 10,000 times, and there was nothing in them. She could have shouted, "Don't go," to a boy flanked by 2 Astartes, going nowhere by choice. She could have shouted the truth, whatever fragment of it she had, and sent him up that ramp in terror instead of in joy, and to what end? She could have told him she loved him, which she had never once said in 3 years, because you do not say that on Kalyx Deep, because saying it is for people who expect to have time. What she did was raise her hand. Just that. And Tam, grinning at the top of the ramp between 2 silent white-faced giants, raised his back, and then the shift boss in her, the thing that had run number 4 seam for 11 years, and had never in all that time come up short, did the only thing it knew how to do. She counted him. 1. Out loud, in the freezing air, to nobody, the way she had counted 26 onto a lift 5 days out of 6 for 2 years. 1 up, and the line moved on. Marda Wren opened her mouth and found she could not think of one single thing to say to him that would not be a lie or a cruelty, and the line moved on. And that is the last time she ever saw him with his own face. Chapter 5. The Outer Dark. The ship was called the Nicor, which Marda learned from the serf's hand signs, and which she was told, much later, was an old Terran word for a sea monster. I have described a great many ships in this domain. I have described the drowned and the haunted and the possessed. The Nicor was none of those things. The Nicor was worse in a way that took Marda months to name, and the name she finally gave it was this. It was a ship that had stopped being maintained for anyone's comfort a very long time ago, and had simply gone on working. It was cold. Not cold like a badly heated hab, cold like the surface of Kalyx, permanently, in every compartment, so that the 260 new serfs of the second group spent their first weeks in a huddled misery that killed 19 of them. It was dark. The Carcharodons do not light their vessels for human eyes. They light them for their eyes, which means they largely do not light them at all, and the corridors of the Nikor were black, and the serf gangs moved through them by memory and by touch, and by the guide ropes strung along the walls at hand height, which Marder came to understand had been strung there generations ago by serfs who were themselves long dead. It leaked radiation. There were sections marked with old hand-daubed sigils that the serfs would not enter and would not explain, and the crew died young, and everyone knew why, and no one wrote it down. Whole decks were sealed. Whole decks were simply dark, uncrewed and unlit and unentered for centuries, and the ship was so vast and so old that nobody living aboard her, not the serfs, and Marder came to suspect not the Astartes either, knew the whole of her, and she was old. That was the thing that sat on Marder worst. Once she had the vocabulary for it. Once she had spent a year in the Nikor's belly, polishing votive plates in the reclamation shrine. The ship was old, the way the armor was old. There were deck plates aboard that vessel with maker's marks the Mechanicus adepts of the TITHE ships would not have recognized. There were sections of hull that had been repaired with hull from other ships, and those with hull from others still, so that the Nikor was less a vessel than an accumulation, a thing grown by accretion the way a reef grows, and somewhere at the very center of the accretion was an original ship that had come out of the Imperium's earliest and darkest years and had not seen a friendly port since. They did not dock. They did not resupply. They had no forge world, no home world, no recruiting world, no chapter keep, and for 10,000 years they had sailed the black outside the reach of the Astronomican and kept themselves alive by taking, at intervals, from worlds like Kalyx Deep. There were, Marder estimated, perhaps 9,000 serfs aboard the Nikor, and she never met more than a few hundred of them, and the ship was large enough that this was not strange. They were drawn from 100 worlds and 100 tithes across a great many centuries, and you could see it in them. Skin of every shade, bone structures from worlds she had no names for, and among them a large number who had clearly been born aboard, because serfs are permitted to breed and their children are the next generation of serfs, and nobody has ever needed to explain that to anyone. The shipborn were different. They had never seen a sky. They were pale, not as pale as the masters, but paler than anyone from a world, and they moved through the black corridors without the guide ropes, because they had never needed them, and they had the flat, unbothered manner of people to whom all of this is simply how existence is arranged. Marder found them the most frightening thing on the ship after the Astartes themselves. It is one thing to be enslaved. It is another to meet a 19-year-old who has never once in her life wondered whether things might be otherwise. The hand language was old, and it was enormous. That surprised her more than anything. She had expected a crude thing, a few dozen practical gestures. Pull, lift, stop, danger. It was not that. It was a full language, with tenses and jokes and a grammar, developed over Emperor knows how many centuries by generations of tongueless people who still needed being human to gossip and to flirt and to complain about the food and to tell their children stories. There were signs in it for concepts that had no possible practical use aboard a warship. Signs for harvest, for dawn, for rain. Signs carried down through centuries by people who had never seen rain and were teaching the sign to children who never would. Marder learned that language in the dark, badly, over 4 years. And it was the single thing that kept her a person, and I want that recorded in a story that has very little else in it worth keeping. At the bottom of the most silent ship in the galaxy, in total darkness, a community of mutilated slaves had built and maintained a language rich enough to be funny in. The masters had taken their voices. They had not managed in 10,000 years to take the talking. She learned what she learned in hand signs and in silence. That was the other thing. They took her tongue in the 4th month. It was done in the Medici Bay by a surf chirurgeon with a scarred face and steady hands. And it was not done in anger, and there was no ceremony to it. And afterward another serf brought her broth and sat with her while she wept. She never learned the reason, and no one aboard could have told her. The practice was older than any of them. She came to have theories. That silence was doctrine, and the ship must be as silent as the men who owned it. That a mute crew cannot spread rumor, or heresy, or the truth about where the chapter goes, and what it does when it gets there. That it was simply a mark of ownership, the way you crop an ear. In the end, she settled on the theory that unsettled her most, which was that there was no reason at all. That it was a thing the Nikor had done to its serfs for so long, that the question of why had rotted away centuries ago and left only the doing. And so Marder Wren, shift boss of number 4 Seam, who had never come up short in 11 years, joined the mute-scarred surf gangs of a chapter that has no name for itself in any language humans use anymore, and learned the hand signs, and learned the guide ropes, and learned the dark. Here is what she pieced together over the years, out of 1,000 small, silent conversations, and it is as much as anyone outside that chapter has ever known. They called themselves nothing that translated. The word the serfs signed for their masters was a hooked gesture, a jaw closing. The Imperium's name for them, Carcharodons Astra, was not a name they used. They had a founder, and they did not name him either. In the reclamation shrine, where Marder polished the votive plates, there was a niche with no statue in it and no plaque, and every serf aboard knew to bow their head passing it. And when Marder asked in signs who it was for, the old surf master signed back the only thing anyone ever signed about it, the one we have forgotten. That was all. They had a primarch, or a founder, or a first captain, some progenitor at the root of them, the way every chapter has one. And they had lost him, or hidden him, or been made to forget so long ago that all that remained was an empty niche and the habit of bowing to it. 10,000 years of men bowing to a hole where a name used to be. The empty niche was the strangest thing aboard that ship, and Marder kept coming back to it for 19 years, because she polished the plates around it twice a week and had a great deal of time to think. Every chapter of the Adeptus Astartes descends from one of the Emperor's sons. That much even a miner from Kalyx Deep knows. It is in the devotional plates. The Primarchs are the spine of the Imperium's whole story about itself. 20 demigods, half of them fallen, and every space marine alive traces his gene line to one of them, and knows the name and carries it like a surname. It is the first thing they teach an aspirant. It is who you are. These did not have one. Or, and this is the thing that took Marder years to arrange in her head, these had one and had lost him, and had gone on for so long without him that the losing had itself become the tradition. There was no statue in the niche because there was no likeness. There was no name carved because there was no name. There was a hole in the wall of the reclamation shrine, and it had been kept clean and lit by a single lumen for longer than anyone could tell her. And every serf, and she came to understand, every Astartes aboard inclined their head to it in passing, and the sign for it was the one we have forgotten. She asked once, in her 9th year, when she had enough of the language and enough standing to risk it, the only question that mattered. forgotten how. And the surf master, an old woman by then, the third surf master Marder had known, thought about it for a long while, and then signed back the longest answer she ever received about anything aboard that ship. It came out roughly as, "No one made us forget." There is no story of a punishment. There is no story at all. That is the forgetting. We went out into the dark, and the dark is very large, and we were out there a very long time, and somewhere in it, the name stopped being passed down. Not hidden, not taken, just dropped. The way you drop a thing in the dark and cannot find it, and eventually stop looking, and eventually forget what it was you were looking for, and eventually only remember that you are looking. That is what 10,000 years outside the light does. Not treachery, not damnation, attrition. You lose your supply and you improvise. You lose your recruiting world and you take a tithe. You lose your orders and you keep the mission as you last understood it. You lose your homeworld, your forge, your allies, your place on any chart the Imperium keeps. And last of all, so slowly nobody aboard can point to the century it happened. You lose the name of the one you came from, and all that is left is the habit of bowing to the place where he used to be. Marder Wren spent 19 years polishing votive plate around a hole in a wall, and came to understand that the hole was the truest portrait of her masters aboard the whole ship. She saw the chapter master once, at a distance, in the 5th year, across the vast dark of the embarkation deck. A figure larger than the others, in plate that was black-red rather than bone, with 2 great crackling claws where his hands should have been, and the serfs around her all went to their knees and pressed their faces to the deck so fast that she was slow and got a look. The hand sign for him was a wave breaking. She was told, in signs, in fragments, that his name meant something like the Red Wake, and that he had been leading them since before the oldest serf aboard had been born, and that no one knew for how much longer than that. And she learned about the young ones. That was the last thing she learned, and the reason I am telling you any of this at all. The 31 from Kalyx Deep were taken to a part of the ship the serfs did not go. Marder never went. But the Nikor had one work gang that serviced the aspirant decks, hauling water, hauling out what needed hauling out. And over 11 years Marder made herself useful to them, and learned in signs, in pieces, what happens to a boy the chapter picks. The serfs called that part of the ship the Deep Water. Not as a joke, it was simply the name. An old sign made with a flat hand pushed down and away, and it covered the aspirant decks and the apothecarian and whatever lay past them. And the rule about it was absolute and required no enforcement. You did not go, you did not ask, and you did not talk about the ones who had gone. Marder broke the last of those 3 rules exactly once, in her 11th year, with a hauler named Fen, who had been on the aspirant deck water gang for 2 decades, and who was dying by then and past caring what he signed. She asked him what it was like in there. He thought for a long time, and then he signed slowly, cold, dark, quiet, like the rest of the ship but more. And then, after a pause, they do not scream. That is what I cannot get used to after 20 years. Boys of 15, and what is done to them, and they do not scream. They are taught not to, in the first month, before anything else. Before the knives. That is the first lesson, and everything else comes after. Marder asked how they were taught it. Fen looked at her for a while with an expression she couldn't read, and then he made the sign for the red comes up, and then he made the sign for watching, and then he put his hands down and would not sign anything else about it, ever again. Most of them die. That is the beginning and the middle of it. Of the 31 taken from Kalyx Deep, The serf's count said 4 were alive at the end of the first year. The rest are used up in the trials and the surgeries and the long agonies of implantation, and the chapter does not mourn them, and the serfs haul out what needs hauling out. And the 4 who live are not the boys who went in. They are cut and grown and remade and put into the dark to see whether the dark keeps them. And the ones the dark keeps come out white as chalk, with eyes like wet stones, because that is what 10,000 years outside the light does to a gene line that was never meant to be out there. And they are given plate 10,000 years old, with rivets hammered into it. And they are taught to be silent, and they are taught to hunt, and in 20 years or 50, they will stand on the ore processing floor of some other cold world at the edge of everything, and watch a woman scream at them about a boy she is responsible for, and their faces will have nothing in them at all. That is the whole of it. That is what the Carcharodons are, and I have taken you the long way round to it, because it cannot be understood any other way. They are not evil. Marder came to believe that, and it was no comfort. Evil is a thing with a face that wants something from you. The Night Lords were evil, gloriously and articulately evil, and you could hate them cleanly. The Carcharodons want nothing from you. They are what is left when you take a weapon the Imperium forged for its own defense and cast it out past the last light, and leave it there for 10,000 years with no supply, no support, no orders, and no way home. And it does not break, and it does not turn traitor, and it does not die. It adapts. It goes pale and black-eyed and silent. It stops speaking because there is no one to speak to. It stops announcing itself because there is no one to announce itself to. It learns to feed on the only thing out there worth feeding on, which is us, and it takes what it needs, and it goes back into the dark, and it does this for 100 centuries, without once being thanked, or paid, or relieved. Because the Imperium that made it has entirely forgotten, it exists the way the chapter itself has forgotten the one in the empty niche. They are not monsters that came out of the outer dark. They are what the outer dark makes out of us, given long enough. That is the horror of them. Every one of those white silent things was somebody's boy once, on somebody's cold rock, grinning at the ramp because he had been chosen. And here is the last turn of the knife, the one Marder came to in her 16th year and could never get out from under. They are not wrong. That is the thing. Judge them. She did, for years, with everything she had left, and then start subtracting. Take away their homeworld, take away their forge, their supply, their allies, their orders, the Imperium's whole enormous apparatus of resupply and reinforcement, and the light of the Astronomican itself, and set them adrift past the edge of every chart for 10,000 years with a duty they will not put down. Now, how would you like them to sustain themselves? Where should they get recruits? Where should the plate come from, and the seed, and the crews? There is no answer. There has never been an answer. The Imperium sent a weapon out past the light, and never once thought about what a weapon eats. And the weapon worked it out on its own, and what it worked out is the red tithe. And the appalling, unbearable, grim dark fact of it is that every world they have ever bled would have been raided, enslaved, flayed, or simply left to rot by something far worse if they had not been there. Kalyx Deep would have belonged to the Night Lords. Every soul in that muster hall would have gone into the pens. The Carcharodons genuinely, materially saved 416 people from a fate that does not bear description, and then took 260 of them, and 31 of their children, and everything the colony had, and left the rest to starve on schedule. Both of those are true. Neither cancels the other. There is no arithmetic anywhere in the Imperium of man that resolves them, and Marder Wren spent 19 years in the dark looking for one, and did not find it, and that failure, Not the tongue, not the cold, not even the boy, is what finally broke her. Because a monster you can hate, a savior you can thank, but a thing that is both at once, that saves you and harvests you in the same motion, and does not consider the two acts to be in any tension whatsoever, gives a human being nothing to hold on to at all. Marda Wren served aboard the Nicor for 19 years, and died of the lung rot that takes most of them, in a black corridor 2 decks above the reclamation shrine. And if this account had come from her hand, it would end there. It does not. This account was assembled from her hand-signed testimony, taken down by a serf scribe who could write, in a ledger that has been aboard that ship for longer than any imperial record admits the ship has existed, one of a great many such ledgers, kept for no reason anyone can now name, in the same way the tongues are taken for no reason anyone can now name. How it left the Nicor, we do not know. Things drift out of the outer dark sometimes. That is the only explanation there has ever been for anything that comes from out there. But there is a last entry, and I will give it to you, and then I will let you go. In her 17th year aboard, Marda Wren was part of a surf gang moving votive plate through the embarkation deck when a returning company came aboard from a boarding action, and the gangs were made to kneel and press their faces to the deck as the Astartes passed, as the gangs always were. And Marda, who was old by then and had stopped being careful, looked up. They came past in file, silent, in bone and rust plate with the rivets standing proud of it, helms mag-locked at their belts, white faces and black eyes, and near the end of the file there was one who was younger than the others, or newer. The scars on his jaw still raw and recent, the language of them freshly cut, and as he passed he turned his head, very slightly, and looked down at the kneeling surf gang. At her, for perhaps a second and a half. She signed his name. She could not speak it. She had not been able to speak for 13 years. She got her old scarred hands up off the deck, and she signed it, the way she had signed it 1,000 times in 1,000 black corridors, the sign she had made up herself for a boy she once falsified a roster for, because there is no hand sign in the chapter's silent tongue for Tam. And the young Astartes with the raw scars looked at her hands. He did not stop. He did not slow. The file went past and out through the great hatch, and the surf gang was signed back to its feet, and Marda Wren picked up her end of the votive plate and carried on, because that is what you do, and there was a great deal of deck left to cross. She never decided what she had seen. That is the honest end of it, and she knew it was the honest end, and she made her peace with it the way she had made her peace with the cold and the dark and the silence. It might have been the boy. The age was right, the timing was right, the scars were new. It might have been any one of the 4 survivors out of 31, or one of 10,000 others taken off 10,000 other rocks. And she was an old half-blind woman, kneeling on a deck in bad light, who wanted very badly for it to be him. She knew that about herself. She had been a counting woman all her life, and she knew the difference between a number and a hope. But he had turned his head. That was the thing she came back to. In the last 2 years, working the shrine, polishing plate around a hole in a wall. Nothing else on that ship ever turned its head. In 19 years, not one of them had ever once looked at her, or at any surf, for any reason, and this one had turned and looked down, and looked at her hands, while she made a sign that meant nothing to anybody in the galaxy, but her and one boy from number 4 seam. And there was nothing in his face at all. This account ends here, as they all do. The chapter designated Carcharodons Astra remains unclassified, unassigned, and unaccounted for by the Departamento Munitorum. Its strength is unknown, its origin is unknown, Its position at the time of this recording is unknown, as it has been for 10,000 years, and will be until the night it is not, until some cold, forgotten rock at the edge of your own sky stops answering its vox, and something ancient and patient and pale comes up out of the deep water it has always lived in, more to take what the dark is owed. They are not coming to save you, traveler. Do not make that mistake. Nothing that has been alone out there for that long comes for anything but the tithe. Sleep if you can, and if you should ever find yourself grateful for a silence where the screaming used to be, remember Kalyx Deep, and ask what has come into the room.